Hi, this is Dr. Andrea Hyde. You can call me Andrea. This is EDS 500 Educational Research, the first time that I am teaching this course for Western Illinois University. And the text that I chose is called An Introduction to Educational Research, Connecting Methods to Practice. So this is the presentation for Chapter 1. And I'm using Screencastify on my Chromebook to record the sound. So I hope it sounds okay. So we're just going to go over the slides for Chapter 1 of the text. And the topics that I'm going to cover are the framework for the text, which is practitioner scholars. That is the focus of the explanation, the examples, the meaning making from the authors are going to be to an assumed audience of practitioner scholars. So we'll define what that means. And then the purpose and types of educational research as these authors define them. Using problems of practice to frame research, and they're going to give you throughout this text 4 problems of practice so that they can keep going back to the same educational problems to emphasize the different questions, designs, methods, and analysis types that would be applied depending on whether or not you're using say a quantitative over a qualitative approach to the research. They briefly go over some research paradigms and research methodologies, and you'll get more of each of those on the qualitative side in EDS 504, qualitative research, and in EDS 503, which is our quantitative research class. So, practitioner scholars. Practitioner scholars are individuals who have a teaching practice or an administrative practice who want to investigate some problem related to their practice in a comprehensive and systematic way. So that is using the tools of science. The assumption is that practitioner scholars are consumers of research and also use research skills. So in this course, we have a lot of practice in reading research, dissecting it, picking out the author's intentions, framework, approach, methods, and try to evaluate whether or not the design was appropriate for approaching the problem. And then the second assumption about practitioner scholars for the purpose of this book is that they use problems of practice to frame their research. So that is, you might be a teacher and also a researcher and interested in research that has to do with some interesting aspect of the counterculture. Maybe your first background is in sociology like mine. But the assumption in this book is that your research is going to be focused on some problem related to your teaching or administrative practice. So we know that there are other and interesting things to study, but for the purposes of this text and describing research methods, the assumption is going to be that your research interests have to do with your practice. So what are the research traditions? Here's their definition of research. So Lockmiller and Lester say it's a systematic investigation designed to make sense of complex everyday problems that impact one's work as a professional educator. You might read other research methods textbooks that liken the research methods to the scientific method, but that's only some kinds of research. Um, I've read texts on research methods for the social sciences that say that everyone in education belongs to the social sciences, and the social sciences all follow the scientific method. Therefore, all educational researchers should be following the scientific method. And maybe that depends on how broad you want to interpret the scientific method. But in this course, I'll be encouraging you to think about research as something larger that expands beyond the scientific method. Of course, that has to do with the level of control that we introduce into studies. And traditionally, it's been qualitative research that has been less interested in controlling variables and more interested in understanding things as they naturally are. So, to further define research, you can talk about basic research. Um, Maybe this is lab research or clinical research. It's meant to generate new knowledge and understanding about a research topic of interest. And then applied research is always going to be to understand a particular problem related to something that you're working on. So in this case, applied research means that the aim is to understand a problem of practice and use the research to address the problem. The authors list for you several purposes, several general purposes of research. And if you were to write a research proposal for one of the programs at Western, you would be asked to describe the purpose of your research. So knowing these four broad categories might come in handy later on. Descriptive research is going to do what it sounds like it's going to do, is provide important information about what is, not trying to change anything, just trying to understand it, perhaps to critique what's going on, but certainly to describe it. So you can describe it neutrally, you can describe it favorably, or you could describe it negatively. So those are the options for descriptive research. Of course, some researchers are going to say that all research should be bias-free, and other researchers say that research is never bias-free, and we'll get into that a little bit later. There's predictive research, and again, sounds like what you might think. It's designed to help the researcher anticipate what is likely to happen given particular changes in outcomes. So if this is definitely part of the purpose of research that aims to control variables, or to track the progress of something. Economists work on predictive models, as do environmental scientists, so studying patterns of how things have behaved in the past. But it could also have to do with making guesses about what would happen if we control this variable, what would happen to other variables. Then there's explanatory research. Of course, this is going to try to answer why is something going on. You might be generating a theory about something. And we actually have one of the qualitative methodologies called grounded theory that actually aims to do that. And then improvement-oriented research is meant to improve a particular kind of problem that you're studying. The three main research traditions that your authors list are qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. And then they add in applied research as a different kind of research tradition, although if you're classifying them by the methodology and the methods, then applied research doesn't really fit this scheme, because applied research could use qualitative methodologies, quantitative, or both quantitative and qualitative, and that's mixed methods research. So applied research, or action research, I'm sorry, is something that has to do with the intentions of the researcher, and we'll get to that in a minute. So qualitative research, and we have an entire course on this, is just typically interested in studying things, people in educational research in their natural environments. And the focus is on exploring and understanding how people make sense of and experience the world in which they live. So in qualitative research, you're going to have interviews and focus groups and also your own observational notes. But the focus is on the experience of what's going on from the perspective of someone, including yourself as the research instrument. And then quantitative research is everything that we think of as traditional scientific research using numerical data. So even surveys that ask people for their responses to things and offer them a Likert type scale, agree, disagree, neither agree nor disagree, and then convert those responses into numbers. That's still quantitative. So quantitative means counting. Quantitative methodologies are always going to use some kind of math, usually statistics, to perform tests on the data to see if there are any significant relationships going on. Whereas in qualitative research, we don't use that. We take a look at themes that are emerging from descriptions and interview and focus group transcripts to see if there are relationships that appear there. So quantitative research is looking for relationships between the data, and also usually make some kind of statement at the end about the strength of the relationship among the data. And then mixed methods research is any research approach that is using both qualitative and quantitative research methods. Now, if you have heard about or read about mixed methods research on your own, it's a developing field of study. There are entire books devoted to mixed methods research, and some people view it as something very different at the level of paradigm. And we'll talk about what a paradigm is in a little bit. So mixed methods research could be thought of as very pragmatic kind of research that uses just both qualitative and quantitative research methods, or it could be a design that actually takes a look at different levels of understanding. So here we have action research, and as I said, it's a thing apart because it is aimed at making change, immediate change. So, and we don't know just by calling it action research whether or not it's going to be using qualitative or quantitative methodologies, but it does have an intentional focus on a current problem. And in our examples here, they're going to be problems of educational practice. In the tradition of action research, especially outside of this country, it's usually justice oriented too. So we'll sometimes take a critical lens and be interested in examining issues of inequity with the goal of somehow making that situation more equitable. Another way to interpret action research is that it seeks to improve the conditions of the participants involved. So we're going to take a look at the way that the authors now use problems of practice to frame research. And this is their definition of a problem of practice. And you might guess it's those everyday challenges that are you're faced as a teacher or a leader, or a counselor or a social worker, or a behavior interventionist in your school site or an educational environment. And there are 4 problems of practice that are used to explain the 3 research traditions and then also action research. So your authors have tried to tie together these themes, these big problems, to illustrate for you the research traditions. And so and these are hypothetical, but also perennial, seems to be now in our modern era of schooling in the United States. These are problems that are continuously being studied. So, and some of them are required by federal law. This one certainly is. So the first problem of practice is promoting educational equity in student achievement, also phrased as closing the achievement gap. Looking at that from a critical lens, it's sometimes called closing the opportunity gap. And the authors are going to refer to this particular problem to introduce quantitative methods. So using quantitative methodologies and methods, we're going to ask, what are the underlying causes of the achievement gaps or the opportunity gaps? And if you're not familiar with this, that means the gap in educational funding, access, experience, outcomes for between white, affluent, able-bodied males, right? Those are not just all one, but the categories of dominance, and non-white, special education or English learning, low-income female, right? So we're studying what are those different gaps between the groups. And what's interesting now is that although there is still some disparity with regard to sexual harassment between, let's say, biological males and biological females, because when you get into sexual harassment, the most targeted students are trans students. But with the exception of that, biological females, tend to be doing better with educational outcomes. So we're still taking a look at educational access, opportunities, and experiences, but with regard to educational outcomes, biological females seem to be outperforming biological males at every level except when we get to the PhD. And that is a specific case of the internalized and socialized expectations that biological females will be primary caregivers, not just for children, but for parents and other family members. Another question that you might ask about this issue, promoting educational equity in student achievement or access or opportunity, what factors influence school conditions? So if you're using quantitative methodologies and controlling one variable or another, you could ask, how does poverty affect academic achievement? How does language learning affect educational achievement? How does the educational background of one's parents affect educational achievement? Here's the second one. The problem of practice is called implementing educational policies. So we're handed down law from the federal government, which is interpreted through the state governments who write plans for all of the public schools in their states. And then these turn into particular policies. They're statewide policies or district policies. A lot of times they're connected to law, sometimes they're connected to grants, other times they're connected to community or local initiatives. This is used to introduce mixed methods research, so the kind that uses both quantitative and qualitative methodologies and methods. And one of the questions could be, what are the challenges and opportunities that arise from educational policies? So we're open to learning about perspectives of people and also the actual outcomes as converted into numerical data, right? So studied qualitatively to use the data to understand the perspectives of those involved, and quantitatively to use data to explain the causes or correlations between one variable and another, age and or the, let's say, the something that we know, the socioeconomic status of your parents and your likelihood of getting into college. Even more closely, your likelihood of scoring highly on the SAT. Okay, problems of practice 3, reforming and improving educational organizations. And this is an example used to illustrate qualitative research. So a broad central question might be, how might we define and understand that activities at the micro and macro levels of organizations, so conditions, beliefs, behaviors, and actions that people take relative to the mission of the organization. And of course, in qualitative research, we are going to want to ask the people involved, ask for their perspectives, but also make observations and record field notes and review those. And the last problem of practice has to do with improving instructional and leadership practice immediately. So the authors of this book interpret action research as being something taken to directly improve the specific initiative going on in the classroom, the school, or the district. So the focus is designed on very discrete improvement of practice. And when teachers in the curriculum and instruction department are pursuing their master's degrees, their culminating project is called an action research project because it is specifically meant for them to focus on something that is going on in their classroom that they would like to change, researching an intervention, doing a pretest of, say, math ability for the whole class and for several specific groups of students, introducing the intervention, and then doing a post-test of the whole class and those individual students. So they're using numerical data. They're also using observational data of their own, and it's meant specifically to enhance math ability or whatever it is that they're studying. So a question might be, how effective was my intervention in the reading fluency of the English learners in my current third grade class? Or what has our morning mindfulness practice done to reduce behavior referrals in my classroom? Okay, moving on to the research paradigm. For the purposes of this textbook, research paradigm is phrased as just a way of thinking about and making sense of the world. So we can, rather than go into it more deeply, examining the philosophy of science, we'll just think of it that way. So a paradigm is the way of thinking about and making sense of the world. It does involve, though, two words that we discuss in philosophy: ontology and epistemology. So ontology has to do with reality, what we think of as the nature of reality. And the options are usually that reality is one, or something more than that, that there are multiple forms of reality. And it doesn't have to have meaning in the sense of physics, physical reality, but either there is an objective reality here, or other people experience reality differently. That's usually the basic split. Epistemology is the idea of knowledge construction. And epistemology is a branch of philosophy that centers around theories of knowledge. What counts as knowledge? How do we know something? So, depending on how you interpret ontology and epistemology, that is going to make up your research paradigm, and make up your paradigm about everything, actually, about the world, your reality, your experiences, life, the universe, and everything. So here are 5 research paradigms that these authors suggest to you. Other authors will arrange different ones, more, less, call them by different names. The first 2 are related to traditional scientific research, and I would say that it's very rare that you'll get even a biological scientist to claim a positivist view of research. That means research can identify a single truth. Even biological clinical researchers understand the influence of bias, the researcher error, right, human error, that the very questions and the very operations and tests that they're doing aren't complete. So you can either, you have the option to work in some kind of degree of error and then proceed as if there is just one single truth to be found about any particular thing that you're studying. Or far more likely now, our clinical, our hard scientists, our quantitative researchers, are very objective, one reality out there, this is how we find it by science kind of people, take a post-positivist paradigm. And that means that reality exists, but we're never going to be able to measure it absolutely accurately. So the best we can do is to come to some approximation and to go through a series of falsifying things that we believed until we come down into, this is the only thing left. So this is the thing that's going to tentatively be true. So approximating truth. So the results are always tentative. And if you read the research studies, as you will in this course, you'll see that a lot of times at the end of the study, even if there are strong connections and very significant causal relationships between variables in quantitative studies, there's always going to be a call for caution, for more research, for more verification, for more reproduction of those studies, because of this assumption that we're only going to be able to approximate the truth about anything that we're studying. Then we're going to move more into paradigms that are going to be evident in qualitative research. So we've got the constructivist paradigm. Most educational researchers are embodying the constructivist paradigm, and they might not talk about it, they might not name it this way, but it has to do with the fact that we realize that people perceive reality differently. So multiple realities can be studied, and the researcher derives her understanding of the realities by working with and through the participants' perspective. So we understand that there's some perspective that we bring into the research, and there are also multiple and sometimes competing perspectives that we're going to get from the participants involved in the phenomenon that we're studying. Critical and feminist paradigms, it is possible to bring in a critical paradigm, and we'll say that feminist research is part of critical theory. It's possible to do quantitative, use quantitative methods and a critical lens, but the critical lens means that we are not assuming that the phenomenon under study is neutral. We are assuming that there is some struggle for power involved. There is some level of oppression going on, and the intention is to study that, understand it, and to see that change to be more equitable. Kind of like the way that some people interpret action research outside of that specific narrow teacher research tradition within the United States. And then post-structuralist research really does move far to the left when by abandoning any foundations of belief. So there's certainly an acknowledgement of multiple perspectives, but go so far as to assume that there is no single truth to be known. So whatever the conclusions are of the research, they're only tentative, they're partial, they're local, sometimes we say. And that doesn't have to be depressing. Actually, that can be kind of liberating, so that no matter what the conclusion of your research comes up to be, you have this understanding that because there's no foundation to reality, then there's no excuse for you not to pursue the research agenda that you have. And post-structuralists aren't going to always take a stand with regard to inequity, but they certainly are going to disrupt meta-narratives. So they're going to disrupt the assumed privileged position of, say, established educational authorities. And also, part of the post-structuralist tradition in research is to question the designs, the methodology, the methods, the tests, the analysis, and the firm conclusion of especially traditional scientific research and especially quantitative methods. So on page 13 of your text, you can see a little arrangement of the research paradigms, positivist through post-structuralist, and you can compare their ontologies and their epistemologies. And like I said, in most cases in educational research, you're going to have constructivists who are acknowledging multiple realities exist and not in understanding that knowledge is a human construction, so that there are people that contribute to what it is we say that we know. And now defining the research methodologies and research methods. I know this is a lot, and they pack it all into your first chapter, but so this will be, I would say, the densest chapter in the text. And again, if you take the qualitative research, you'll dive more fully into the qualitative methodologies. If you take the quantitative research class, you'll dive more deeply into the quantitative methodologies. And then if you're doing a culminating project, you have the opportunity to use both in mixed method research or maybe action research. So first, a little word about methodology and methods. Sometimes these words are used interchangeably and sometimes by researchers themselves, but because we're learning the basics of research methods, I want to point out that methodology is something broader than methods. So your methodology is your stance, how you frame the study, everything that goes into your position, your framing, the approach that you're going to take, any kind of philosophical lens that you're going to bring in, the design of your study, and then your methods, the methods that you use to collect data, but then your plan for analyzing the data and making sense of it and representing your results. So methods are just one part of your methodology, of your research design. And then particular methods are associated with particular methodologies, and they're not stuck to them like glue, but there is some logic, and it's worthwhile in writing a research proposal to defend why it is that you decide to use a certain method with a certain methodology. And that's far more commonly done in qualitative research. There is some privilege associated with traditional scientific research that uses quantitative methodologies and methods, in that they assume that these are the methodologies and methods that everyone should be using to study problems. And so there's this idea that they don't have to explain the justification for using a methodology or a method. So again, this sounds like we're repeating things, but I just want to point out that the research methodologies pair along with the research tradition. So you've got qualitative methodologies, right, that are used in qualitative research. That's kind of what that means. So explore chapter 5 for those. You have quantitative methodologies that are paired with quantitative research, and explore chapter 6 for those. And then it's actually, this is a typo, chapter 10, there's not 510 chapters. Chapter 10 talks about mixed methods. So usually takes a pragmatic approach, and that's a specific kind of philosophical position that sort of accepts the problem as it is without worrying about whether or not it should be as it is. But taking a look at that, and then using whatever methods are going to get you to the most answers most quickly. So it's a stance of efficiency, and it understands that there might be conditions or philosophical implications that are worth pursuing, but they're not going to be pursued in this kind of study. So that's what we mean by pragmatism when we're using it to describe research. So mixed methods are methods that are going to be, or a mixed methodology is going to be a methodology that uses both quantitative and qualitative methods. And from page 15 of your book, you have a nice chart that shows the methodologies, the qualitative and the quantitative methodologies. And these are the ones that are going to be described in this book. These are not by any means all of the different methodologies. So research design is even broader than methodology. So research design is your entire plan for studying the problem of practice. And when you're writing a research proposal, there are going to be several subcategories under your research design. Your research design tells your reader exactly what you're going to be doing, why, using what methodology, what methods, how you're going to analyze, how are you going to talk about your own bias, what are the checks for validity or reliability or trustworthiness that you're going to use. What are your results going to look like, and what are you going to do with the results afterwards? So again, you should be articulating this if you're writing a research proposal for a class. When we write research, when we describe research design in our published research, we don't always mention this, especially if we're writing from the traditional scientific research background. Qualitative researchers will always describe their research design, and I've read some quantitative researchers that do as well. And on page 16 of your text, you have a few characteristics of qualitative and quantitative research traditions. So just divided by their purpose, the research paradigms that they might use, and analytic approach, types of data, and researcher role. And so here you see these authors are trying to simplify things for you. So they're saying that quantitative research traditions are going to take up positivist research paradigms, but it's far more likely to even see these folks using post-positivist. Positivist is really rare. We just aren't that, we have more humility than that. Researchers have more humility now. So that's the end of the presentation for chapter one. If there's something that you didn't understand, please feel free to contact me. Check out the corresponding pages in the textbook, study the charts. Hopefully that makes sense to you. But if it doesn't, if you're new to this, hang in there. This is a very heavy chapter, and it's just going to get easier. Hopefully, the pedagogy of the text is set up um, to using the problems of practice to focus on. It's going to make this easier for you to understand.